Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. In this lesson, we're going to look at the proximate effects. That is to say, the effects that take place during and immediately after the Great War. If you are in my class, you're taking notes primarily in the left-hand column, proximate effects. That right-hand column, I'll explain what's going on there shortly in the video. But to begin with, one of the proximate effects is what I call industrial warfare. Industrial warfare is basically taking the ethos of the Industrial Revolution, namely producing things cheaper and faster and more efficiently than before. In this case, in a rather unfortunate turn of events, that is producing the elimination of your enemy faster and cheaper and more efficiently. One of the ways to do that has to do with new technologies of weapons. Now, if you recall, at the end of the 19th century, the machine gun, the Maxim machine gun, was sort of limited to the British initially. By the time World War I, the Great War, breaks out, everybody has come up with some version and made improvements on it, including the British. But the idea is machine guns are now ubiquitous. That is to say, everybody has them. Again, just more efficient in terms of discharging bullets. So machine guns are now just taken for granted. But another aspect of the weaponry for the Great War has to do with these things called mortars. If you recall earlier, cannons were a military technology before, but they don't really work, especially in the context of trench warfare. How are you going to get cannons around when you are, if you get out into no man's land, you're doomed anyways. And so this new technology of mortars appears. And if you take a look at the picture in the bottom right, they're very small, they're mobile, they can be moved from trench to trench. And essentially, the guy on the left here, what you notice is he's got what looks like a bomb. And the way this works is you simply put it down the tube. There's a mechanism at the bottom of it which then launches it out over no man's land and into the enemy's trenches. So mortars become a new type of weapon technology. But the biggest change, perhaps, is the use of chemicals and particularly petroleum. So in this case, what you see an image of is a flamethrower. You're literally sending flames toward your enemies, burning everything in its path. A more extreme version of that is chemical warfare. Again, an effect of the Industrial Revolution, this discovery of ways of harnessing chemicals, is now used to produce destruction among your enemy. And so launching chemicals that will burn the eyes and throat and lungs of anybody who inhales it, even more disturbingly, chemicals that will simply melt away the flesh if it comes into contact. Just all sorts of new, terrible ways to dispatch your enemy as a result of the Industrial Revolution. What's new about this, then, is not so much that they have these things, but they're ubiquitous. Like everybody has them and everybody's using them, and they're way more efficient at affecting your enemy in particular war. But another aspect of industrial warfare is in transportation technology. For example, the German U-boat, U for underwater, what we would call a submarine. The Germans had a whole lot of them. Now, in fact, this technology was attempted in the American Civil War, but the U-boats there were not so effective. The Germans definitely figured out a way to do this, and they figured out a way to launch bombs from them that would hit and then eventually sink ships. Planes as well had been invented before the war. But the twist here is now these new machine guns can be attached to them. And so now you can not just use the plane to survey a battlefield, but also to attack other planes, drop bombs, even if it's just by hand on the enemy. And then we also get this new thing called a tank. The tank originally its purpose was to go over no man's land to provide protection for the soldiers that had to do that. But if you notice, the shape of this tank is such that it's also designed to go over the trench of the enemy. You put that with a variation of a cannon and machine guns, and you can fire even as you are protecting the troops inside. What's new about transportation technologies, though, is now they are becoming weapons themselves. They're not just designed to transport things, to move things, but they become weapons in and of themselves. Now, it's also worth pointing out that older technologies like railways and steamships are playing an increasing factor, although those in larger ways are still moving stuff, sort of more like an older technology. And then in the realm of communication, towards the end of the war, a new type of communication involving two-way radios is starting to be used. It's not used widespread, but it will become a factor in the course of the rest of the 20th century, because most of the communications takes place with telegrams. You need a wire. The problem with that, of course, is if your enemy cuts the wire, they cut communications. Again, the two-way radio technologies, it's invented towards the end of the Great War, but it doesn't really have a huge impact, but it will definitely have a huge impact where you don't need a wire anymore. You can use airwaves to send radio signals. That will become a big issue later in the 20th century. Now, another proximate effect is what is known as total warfare. Total warfare means that any given state is devoting all of its resources to the war effort. In other words, it's not just a military operation. It's everything in the whole society. And there's three aspects that I want you to focus on when we talk about total war. The first of these is political economy. Now, if you don't recall, political economy, this is a gross oversimplification, but one way to think about it is the extent to which the state controls the economy. How does the government actually control it? Well, what happens in the Great War is they control it completely, nationalizing industries across the board. Even those states that were deeply committed to a capitalist free market idea are realizing they have to be able to control production. So they're literally taking over factories and converting them to make whatever it is that they need, and they're making all of the decisions, not the market itself. Another aspect of this has to do with rationing. Again, in a free market, these are not things that would be an issue. If you look at this image, this is a bread ration card. This is literally the German state is measuring how much bread each citizen gets. But in the United States, it was a little more subtle than that. The production of meat, they wanted to shift that to sending overseas to the troops, and so the price of the meat is jacked up, and so they're encouraging people to find other sources of protein in this particular poster. Another aspect of total war, though, has to do with dealing with social classes. For example, how do you get men to sign? Well, you can get them to enlist by forcing them to what we would call a draft, mandatory conscription. But particularly among the Allied powers, there was a resistance to do that initially, and so they wanted to try to attract men. In this case, a poster from the British. I want to point out the image that most of us think of when we think of Uncle Sam pointing is directly related to that. That pointing to a person, a man, a young man in particular, to join comes out of the effort during World War I, the Great War, for recruiting potential soldiers. But it's more than just the men. It involves women and children. And we'll get into the aspect of children in an activity later in class. But women are now called on to do roles that maybe they hadn't before. For example, nurses who are staffing the hospitals of the many casualties of the war. That maybe is not so new. But now they're also being called to do things that they might not have before, like, for example, taking over the agricultural responsibility that would have fallen to men that are now serving, or even working in factories, these factories that have been nationalized to produce weapons of the sorts that we just looked at earlier on. So now there's a whole change in the expectation of different members of society, including minority populations. Now, in the case of the United States, that involves African Americans who many serve in the U.S. Army during the war. But curiously, most of them don't actually see combat because they're not believed to be, they're not designated to be trustworthy enough to be in combat. So most of them are serving in support roles. The picture that you see here, they're on burial detail, like their whole mission is to bury the white soldiers who have fallen. Nonetheless, they are serving their country, and when they return home, that's going to create some issues. They're literally putting their life on the line for a country that is still segregating them in very, very obvious ways. I'm going to leave it to your U.S. teacher next year to get into that in more detail. But what an issue we are going to come back to is how does this affect the colonial subjects in empires throughout the world, where they're a minority population in the empire, and yet they're still serving. Come back to that shortly. A third aspect of total war, though, is the use of propaganda. Propaganda is information that is pushing a particular point of view, leading to a call to action. Now, we're going to look much more closely at how propaganda works in an activity later on in the week. But the big idea right now is, first of all, it's extremely biased, sometimes just flat out false, like not true at all. But it's being pushed in mass media, which again is a type of communication that's coming out of the Industrial Revolution. And so you've got new ways of trying to manipulate the emotions of people in order to get them to do what you want them to do. And we're talking about people within your own society here. So this is also a proximate effect, this idea of total warfare. But a third proximate effect is global warfare, okay? So if you recall in the previous lesson, we talked about different theaters of war, that the war is really global. Now, you might wonder, okay, is this really new? I mean, after all, I made the case that the 7 Years' War was really the First World War. And you could say, okay, maybe it's a matter of degree, like it's bigger and more, but how much of this is new? That's a legitimate question. But what is undoubtedly new is the way colonial subjects are mixed into this. So let's take a closer look at how that works. Because one of the curious things, particularly among the Europeans, is how this gets mixed in with their ideas about race and ethnicity. And if you recall, scientific racism was part of the motivation, the fueling ideologies for colonialism in the first place. But now it's starting to appear in different ways. For example, there are some races and ethnicities that Europeans view as workers and some as warriors. And so they're trying to use this pseudoscience, race-based, ethnic-based sort of ideas to classify colonial subjects, whether or not they should be allowed to fight or not, based on their assumptions about their sort of racial or ethnic typology. This manifests itself in some very curious ways. But another issue is, should you have mixed regiments? Like, even if you decide that a particular ethnic group or racial group are considered warriors, should they fight alongside with white men? Well, the overwhelming majority of Europeans decide no, they should not. They should be in completely segregated regiments, if they do that at all. And then, should they be allowed to fight in Europe? And this one is particularly curious to me because, like, you're talking about killing your enemy, but there was this overwhelming view among Europeans that it was somehow unseemly for a person of color to kill another white European in Europe. That somehow that wasn't cool, even though it's your enemy and you have total warfare, but somehow that didn't seem right to many Europeans because, a person of color, that's just not something that you allow, even if it's the enemy. So we see all sorts of really bizarre policies involving race and ethnicity in terms of the colonial subjects. That is definitely new. If you look at these images, you can see that some of the peoples from various colonies throughout the world in different ways serve, some of them in military capacities, some in service capacities, some only in other colonial areas. But that leads to another aspect of this, which is the movement of troops. Where are your colonial subjects who serve? Where are they going? If you look at this map, every red line on here is where colonial troops or even, mainland troops are sent around the world. And this is definitely different than, say, the 7 Years' War. If you remember, the war in Southeast Asia was fought between the British East India Company and the French. Like, it wasn't even the French troops or the British troops. Now they're being moved all over. But if you notice, particularly in Africa, almost all Africans are just transported from one African colony to another. That somehow that's okay, but like to have them fight in Europe against other white people is somehow not okay. Very, very unusual perspective on that. Now, there's going to be distant effects of all of this. We'll get into that a little bit later on. But at the present, there's another category that I want to introduce you to called cumulative effects. This would be the right-hand column if you're taking notes on the sheet that you were provided. Cumulative effects are the proximate effects that add up over time. Okay, they're adding up over the course of the Great War. For example, all of them are focused on casualties. And again, we talked about this in the last video, but casualties now are the measure in a war. Not people killed, but people killed, wounded, missing, prisoners, if they can't fight. Okay? So if you look on your chart, the proximate effect of industrial warfare obviously is going to translate to a cumulative effect of military casualties. 37.5 million soldiers approximately are military casualties. If you remember this chart from the previous video, the casualty numbers are just astounding. I mean, 37.466 million casualties. So the scale is just far greater, especially when you consider, almost 60% of all of the men end up as casualties. So this is a cumulative effect of the industrial warfare. But a cumulative effect of total warfare is civilian casualties. There are many different versions or estimates, somewhere between 10 and 13 million civilians. Now, this is something that is totally new. Why? Well, because in wars fought in the past, it was you don't attack civilians. Like it's some sort of gentleman's agreement that you only soldiers fight other soldiers. Well, if you have total warfare, your whole society is focused on the war effort, then that means those people are now targets. One unique new way that this manifests itself is something called the Armenian genocide. Now, and I want to talk about this for a moment for several reasons, but here's the thing I want you to know right now. This is the first time the word genocide is ever used, and it was used after the fact when investigators were trying to figure out what happened to the Armenian population inside the Ottoman Empire. What they witnessed or what they found after the fact was this was something that they had never seen before, and they didn't have a word for it. So the idea of genocide is born. That is trying to eliminate an entire population of a particular racial, ethnic, or religious group of people. In this case, it's the Armenians. Now, this is highly disputed. To this day, the Turkish government denies that this event ever happened. But here's what we know. In this note, this is 1915, the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire is noting that there's an increasing disappearance of Armenians inside the Ottoman Empire. Now, notice this is before the United States is even in the war. But it's noticed that Armenians are just disappearing. If you look at this particular image, the bigger the orange dot, the more Armenians just disappear. Now, you'll notice as well that you've got flight routes, these arrows that are moving around where they moved. The position of the Turkish government is, well, they just migrated out. But many of them were migrating into areas where they could not survive, and they just disappeared. They didn't move to some other place. They're gone. This image is the results of a what we would call a census before the war on the left, and then after 1922 in various villages. And it's just overwhelming. We're talking about almost 2 million people, Armenians in particular, just disappear. Now, why is all of this? Well, the Turkish nationalists, if you recall, are in ascendancy in the Ottoman Empire, and they believe that the Armenians, who are Christians, are actually sort of siding with the Russians, and they're trying to undermine the Ottoman Empire. They view them as a threat. And so they're trying to eliminate this whole population. That is what the word genocide means. Now, again, this is a really controversial topic, but it does seem, first of all, there were many Christian Armenians. They were Orthodox Christians, so were the Russians. They certainly had no love for the Turks. But the evidence is really, really hard to come by. Like, all we know is they disappeared. There have been a few mass graves found, but it's undeniable that the number of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire dramatically declines and is almost completely wiped out. Then the aspect, the proximate effect of global warfare also leads to a cumulative effect in the first global pandemic. Now, you might be going, well, wait a minute, we had the Black Death and we had the Great Dying, but if you think about it, both of those were isolated to half of the world. Bubonic plague, for example, was only an issue in Afro-Eurasia. The Great Dying really only affected the population of the Americas. But what happens in the end of the war and immediately after is the first truly global pandemic that we refer to as the Spanish flu. It was a variety of influenza that was so virulent that it was very deadly, quite literally. The number of people who die, the estimates vary, but it's definitely in the millions globally. But the curious thing about this is how this is directly tied to the global warfare. Now, I want to come back to why we call it the Spanish flu. It did not start in Spain. In fact, the best evidence that we have now suggests that it originated in the United States, specifically Kansas of all places, and then spread globally. Now, here's the thing about that. Why is it called the Spanish flu? Because it was really apparent that particularly the British and the United States knew that this was becoming a global phenomenon, but suppressed any media mention of it. The Spanish press was the first to actually report what was going on. And so it became known as the Spanish flu simply because the Spanish were the only ones to acknowledge it for a while. Nonetheless, it becomes truly global with the movement of forces. Towards the end of the war, when you're moving all of those colonial soldiers around to different parts of the world, they're getting exposed to it. Maybe they get sick, maybe they don't, but they're carrying it. And then at the end of the war, they all go home and they take it back to their homes and it continues to spread. So we get literally the first global pandemic. Again, we're talking about the proximate effects and this new thing, the cumulative effects. All of these taking place during or immediately after the war. Later on, though, we will look at the distant effects, those that are continuing way after the end of the war. I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.